Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I am doing well.
Good.
Always trying to improve my situation and the world's situation.
That's the attitude.
And keep moving the ball toward peace and prosperity, but boy, that ball is heavy.
It's heavy. Indeed.
But today we want to talk about Africom. And I remember about that when they decided they started. Not that we weren't already involved in Africa for a long time. When you think about it, you know, Mogadishu was a big event, and this was before we had the Africom started. But Africom was started. The initial funding came in 2007, and I remember that coming out. Like, why do we need this?
Yeah.
And sure enough, and that was you know the Bush years. I imagine John Bolton was around, and it went actually into effect in 2008. But it was an acceleration of what we were already doing. But the acceleration has been pretty significant. Now, Intercept has come up with an article, and they're analyzing and mentioned there's a Pentagon study to see, well, how well are they doing? This is their report card. And I think you'll tell us a little bit how their report card is going, because it hasn't been all that good, because it's almost like, what would you expect? We went into Iraq to stop Al-Qaeda, and we brought Al-Qaeda to Iraq. In the same way, this was the excuse for us to have Africom, because there had to be terrorists down there. You know, everybody's getting to be called a terrorist. Anything you want to deal with and make him an endless enemy, just call him a terrorist. Anyway, this was changed, and we accelerate, put more troops in there. And it has been going on, but really things are worse. There are more attacks, more people dying, and no more peace. And some people would say, well, that's why we're there. We're trying to bring about peace, and we have to help for humanitarian reasons. And I was thinking back about Mogadishu, that disaster there on Black Hawk Down.
Yeah.
That was staged as all going in to help feed people who were starving from a civil war, and the whole thing is still a mess there.
Yeah.
So they never learn. We're sending more troops, spending more money. There's more chaos, and there's always the excuse, you know, to attack and to stop terrorism. And yet they never stop and say, well, there's more danger here. What's the motivation for people killing Americans? And Americans still do get killed, and that builds up a lot of hatred. What is their motivation?
Yeah.
The one thing is, they rarely, if ever, ask that question. If they do, they never come down with saying, maybe our presence there has something to do with it. And they just go on and put more troops in and jeopardize our troops. And actually, we spend a lot more money. And so far, I would say Africom has contributed zero to moving toward more peace and prosperity. I would say they have done the opposite.
Yeah, in fact, they've undertaken 36 named operations, which is more than any of the other commands in the world. But you go back, we always like to go back to the philosophical origin of things, you know, and the policy origin of things. Here's a mission statement. And I think this is the first hint that something's really wrong here. Here's the mission statement of Africom back when they were thinking it up. Purpose is, quote, to enhance our efforts to bring peace and stability to the people of Africa and promote our common goals of development, health, education, democracy, and economic growth in Africa. I think a normal person who thinks about the Constitution would look at that and say, well, how does the U.S. military fit into this? How is this defending our country? How is this even a role for the U.S. military to do this?
You know, I mentioned Mogadishu, and the big issue there was Black Hawks and Black Hawk Down, the movie and all. The person that wrote the book and became a movie was significant, but the whole point that they describe it was these Black Hawk helicopters arrived to deliver food, and I'm sure the peasants down there, as well as the different factions, and they did have civil strife, they weren't coming really to deliver food in Black Hawk helicopters. They might have come in a different manner. But that's how much hypocrisy is. This whole idea that was established to promote peace and prosperity. You know, by the time Obama and Clinton got hold of it, what were they doing in Libya? That's still a mess, and they made it worse. And how gleeful Hillary became over their effort or their so-called victory in Libya, which was a total failure. It continues, and nobody seems to ever want to challenge. I know we talked about it when this bill was coming up, but I don't think, if I had to recall, I don't think there was really serious talk about it. This was sort of routine. It was only $500 million.
Yeah, no biggie.
But how much have they spent in the last 12 years? Probably a lot more than $500 million.
Yeah, see, the thing is, you mentioned Libya as a failure, but you and I aren't thinking right. We're thinking normal. If you think in the terms of the military-industrial complex, Libya was a massive success because what did it do? When we blew the country up, all of the terrorists that Gaddafi was trying to kill scattered throughout Africa. And so that increased the need for the Africor to go down there and take care of it. But the other thing you mentioned earlier is, how we came to promote peace and prosperity. Imagine, any American should be able to do this. Imagine you're living in a village, a quiet village somewhere in Africa. There's some strife, there's some problems, there's some shortages, and all of a sudden in come the Black Hawks, in come these RoboCop-looking, 22nd century looking military guys. Is your first reaction going to be, oh good, they're coming here to save us, or oh my gosh, this is scary as heck?
Yeah, and you mentioned how the weapons and all and the disruption spread all through Africa, but also some of these weapons ended up in Syria. It motivated the rebels up in Syria, and that's all some wheeling and dealing. But I think you touched on something we touch on a lot, and there are motivations. The motivations they claim are for peace and prosperity and humanitarian reasons, but I think the real motives have something to do with a dollar sign on it.
Indeed, and Nick Turst did a great piece for The Intercept, as you mentioned, and it's kind of our inspiration. We saw it on antiwar.com. So we got to give them a plug for their efforts too. Thanks for your help, guys. But it's really interesting if you just look at the numbers, and Nick does a great job in putting out the numbers. The number, it always starts this way, doesn't it? Oh, it's just a small little thing. The number of U.S. military personnel in Africa under the Africom has increased 170%. The number of military missions, activities, programs, and exercises has increased 1,900%. As I mentioned earlier, they undertook 36 named operations, more than any other region in the world. But, and this gets to the news item, the Pentagon's own think tank, the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, came out with a report this month saying that Islamist group activity has more than doubled since 2012. And the number of violent events has jumped 960% in the last 9 years. So it's having the opposite effect. As we always say, and as the experts always say that don't get listened to, U.S. troops in Africa are a great recruitment tool.
Yes, and these facts are so clear-cut. Why do we lose the argument? Actually, it has to do with the media. And when the Black Hawks went down, and that actually came later, but Carter had to do a lot of rearranging with that because it was such a blatant failure. But it did get out, and people knew about it. And for a few weeks, they knew about it. And I think the Secretary of Defense then had to be changed. And yet we still don't change the policy. But how much has been in the news here? People say, well, you guys need to talk about what's in the news. We want to know what's going on. Well, this is going on, but this is the stuff they're hiding.
Yeah,
and
under the radar.
It's very important. It's part of the deep state, and it's Republican and Democrat. We created a Republican Party, and the Democrats go and use these authorities, and they use the money, and they all have military plants and war plants in their districts and in their states. So there's really no question. And just like we just saw this budget go through, the deal. More food stamps for the poor and more food stamps for the military-industrial complex, and not a whole lot is said. It looks like this whole process is going to continue unless all of a sudden tomorrow the country wakes up and say, hey, that Daniel McAdams from Ron Paul, I think they're on target there. Why don't we ask them to advise our government on foreign policy? Well, don't hold your breath. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't inform people. And it doesn't mean that we can't eventually win. And the tragedy is that I've experienced, of course, was the disaster of the 60s. there were anti-war people, but how long did it take and how many lives had to die? And it was so bad. Right now, if we can hide it, and they're able to hide this better with all the drones and everything that's going on, and they don't see as many ground troops. And Trump is not going to put boots on the ground, but that doesn't mean that the hatred and determination and the loss of life of those people who live there will be improved at all.
And you mentioned the news not covering it. That is so true. But the news doesn't exist. The mainstream news doesn't exist to cover things for people. I was talking to a very intelligent lady over the weekend who says, I can't watch TV news anymore. It's so depressing. And the reason is they only cover this guy's a racist, this guy's racist, this guy said this. There's nothing about this very important thing. So the idea of the mainstream media is not to inform, but to misinform and disinform and to change your view. But we have a couple of pictures that really capture the U.S. in Africa. The first one is a map of Africa that shows a lot of the U.S. activity. This is from the military itself, the strategic posture. And if you look, you can see areas of operation, all that red area. You can see all these dots are different kinds of U.S. military bases, different kinds of areas. So it's throughout Africa. You think, okay, well, that's all right. They're going to get rid of terrorism. Well, let's take a look at the next JPEG. Here's what's happened, Dr. Paul, since we started Africom. Check out how the terrorism is going. Every year it gets worse and worse. There's no decrease. That should be the mirror image. There should be tons of terrorism, and then the longer we're there, the lower it is. But here it is. This is the Pentagon's own chart. I took it straight off the Pentagon's report. This is what's happening in Africa with us there fighting terrorism.
I was just looking back on exactly what their role should be, and you touched on that early on. And we're sending people in there not to take over and run things or have control. It's to advise and to train, just stand aside and bring humanitarian aid to the country, the people who are suffering. They don't mention regime change, but I think that's very much on the minds of our leaders. Is they're always either working on starting a movement toward a regime change or get right in the middle of it. And some of these countries, they're always looking for regime change. There's 2 or 3 factions. The trouble is, even if there's only 2 factions fighting for the control of their government, and it's bad, that once you go in to say, well, we're going to help, it just maybe turns into 4 now. And that's what's been happening in Africa. There's more groups, and this is what the point of this article is there are more groups now, more factions, and more terrorism going on than before. Not that there was much to brag about. Nobody talked about, well, how do we really solve this problem? Well, it's changing people's attitude. One would be trade, and get people to depend on trade, and us have a better understanding. But it's also education, and that's a job and a half. I mean, but to go in there with Black Hawk helicopters and say that you're going to do it our way, and we will show you who the best dictator should be, and this will solve all your problems.
And this whole thing about having these different factions and what are we going to do, the chances are that neither of the 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever the factions were even voted in by anyone. And the other chances, even if the one that was voted in by anyone, probably would go against that one if the other one promised to hand us over some stuff. As Trump said, we'll take their oil. Why not take their oil? So this is now in the Trump administration. As we always talk about this, the disappointment of Trump. He had good instincts. He wanted to reduce. Remember, by the way, back in, 2017, when some U.S. troops were ambushed in Niger. And everyone in Congress said, well, hold on, I didn't know we had troops there. 4 Americans killed. No one had any idea. And I think in response to that, Trump in 2018, he wanted to reduce the U.S. military presence in Africa. Good so far. But unfortunately, what he did is he gave the green light to the CIA to up the drone strikes. So the American troops out so it doesn't look bad, but up the drone strikes, which makes us more hated, causes a lot of misery, hits a lot of innocent people, etc.
When there was an investigation over the Benghazi incident and who orchestrated this attack, and there was one particular leader, and he was finally arrested, and I thought, well, that's good, I guess. But then I find out was it was the FBI that arrested him. The CIA is not supposed to be operating within our borders.
Yeah.
Of course, they do all the
Sure,
time. I
yeah.
mean, how is the communications being captured? And the FBI was supposed to be, a federal event to share, looking for the bad guys in the country. But they're worldwide. We have FBI agents, and we have these special forces, and CIA especially, and that is not monitored. I mean, you can't find out what their plans are. This reveals a lot more than the average report from the CIA, but it's just not there. It's under the radar, and let it go, and people don't ask questions. And Trump is right. The American people don't like to see body bags, and no sense in having boots on the ground. But I don't think that is reducing the animosity against America. For some reason, it's almost like it's worse. Let's say they put on sanctions on a country and you don't see who did that and things get worse. People can get very, very angry about that. So whether it's sanctions or secret activity and punishment or getting involved in these elections, I think one thing that we don't take serious consideration for is the animosity that is a consequence from our foreign policy, and I think it's a major problem, but nobody wants to do that. Then they say, oh, you're blaming America. I blame American politicians who do dumb things and have foreign policy that makes no sense, has nothing to do with protecting America, and they lie to us when they say, yes, we need to do this. This is to defend our Constitution and defend our liberties, and that's why we have to go and fight these fights. And people say, people do have it, when it's 24 hours a day about the magnificence of those people who go away and expose their lives and to this effort to make life so much better and to protect our Constitution, which just isn't true. They go into a war and they don't do it constitutionally, and they say that we have to send you, the young people, to defend the Constitution, and they're defending a war that's unconstitutional, and it's to me an outrage, and it ends badly. And is anything that bothers me the most is when I get on an airplane, and for some reason I see a young man in his late teens or 20s without an arm or without a leg, and the odds are 99% that he was somewhere in the Middle East, someplace, and getting butchered for the whims of some politician and somebody who wants to make some money.
We had to destroy the Constitution to save the Constitution. It's funny you mentioned the FBI. Because when I lived in Budapest, I was just a couple of blocks from a huge FBI building in town. And I always walked by there thinking, this is weird. What are they doing here? But we should get to the meat of this in a way when we've talked about the problem. And the question is, why are we there? And you can oversimplify it. But I think the meat of it is you can see it in a speech that Bolton gave at the Heritage Foundation in December of 2018. He was talking about Africa. He said the U.S. must wake up to the threat posed by China and Russia in Africa. He wasn't talking about Chinese troops. He wasn't talking about Russia invading Ethiopia. He wasn't talking about taking over Libya. He was talking about one of the things he mentioned. The Chinese invested $6.4 billion in Africa between 2016 and 2017. This is a real danger. The Chinese are investing, so we have to send our troops. And that, I think, is the big ripoff.
And we spend a lot more money on military than the Chinese do. And they've made some money because we buy their stuff and because it's cheap for us. Because we don't work and earn money, we print it. And then we export it. It's a great export, and then we get their stuff. And then they dirty little rascals, they save it, and then they go and invest it, and they become state-run capitalists, but they go and they invest in the rare earth elements that are in Africa. That still is an idea that floats around, that shortage, and that is something the Chinese can hold over us. And it isn't because they're bad people and we're good people. It's because of the system that we have devised and the antagonism that we present when we say, well, you do it our way. Right now, I think this trade war is getting much worse with China. It makes no sense whatsoever. Yes, there's problems there, but they can be sorted out, but not threats and not the challenges that could turn out to be militaristic. But anyway, that's going to be there for a while. I think when you look at the conflict with China right now and the way we run our foreign policy, very, very dangerous, because the financial crisis is coming, and I don't think anybody's really prepared for that, because everybody's going to come up short. I just hope that includes the military-industrial complex, but they'll probably be saved to the last. In the deep state, I'm afraid they're going to maintain some power too, but we should keep trying to expose the deep state for what they are, and they're not what we would consider the protectors of peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.